Brian Mudd Show is on News Radio 610 WIOD.
We are joined by attorney and legal expert that we like to turn to on some of these things, Quentin Brogdon. Now, Quentin.
Good morning, Brian.
Yeah, so we've talked a couple different times about where this whole thing is trending in terms of the workplace and vaccines. We've discussed whether it might be legal for businesses to mandate their employees be vaccinated if they're to return to work. I don't know if there's been any change in perspective on this. Where are you at this point? What's your current thought if companies do decide to head down this path?
Well, Brian, as we've discussed, employers probably can require, particularly for employees in high-risk jobs working in a hospital or in a nursing home, that their employees be vaccinated. Under OSHA, they have a general duty to provide a safe workplace. And the question that was kind of hanging in the air until a number of months ago was whether a vaccination was a prohibited medical exam under the Americans with Disabilities Act. The EEOC, the federal agency, said it's not, and that basically opens the door up for employers, even in non-high-risk jobs, white-collar workers sitting behind a desk, to require vaccinations. But the power is not unlimited if the employee has a sincerely held religious belief under a federal law called Title VII against vaccination, or the employee has a disability that would make them more prone to adverse side effects under the Americans with Disabilities Act. The employer has to make reasonable accommodations, which might include allowing the employee to work from home, for example. And testing, there was a question whether that is a medical examination. The EEOC says, yes, that's a medical exam under the Americans with Disabilities Act, but during this pandemic, we're going to let employers test their employees for COVID because of basically the extenuating circumstances. So employers are being given a lot of power over their employees that they normally don't have because of this pandemic. It's not unlimited, but it's a bunch.
Yeah, Quentin, I want to drill down on that because this is kind of my next level concern. It's the same concern I've had over the idea of vaccine passports. It's not even so much about, whether someone knows if I've been vaccinated or somebody else has been vaccinated or not. It's about the implications of having private health information that in the case of a vaccine passport would be shared directly with the federal government and by proxy any number of foreign governments as well, and what that might do as we head down that path. But the other is we've seen an extenuating circumstance that's played out over the course of a year whereby governments from local to state have exerted unprecedented authority over citizens in many respects that would not be constitutional if not for these emergency declarations. And now we're seeing those emergency declarations that are basically being brought over to private business. It seems like, Quentin, every step of the way, the rights to privacy, the rights to healthcare information, which our medical records have always been ours, nobody else's if we don't want them to be, it seems like that's going by the wayside. Do you have concerns that there are abuses along these lines that could lead to people perhaps being shamed by their employer and maybe sought for termination because they aren't going to go along with what the company wants on the healthcare front?
Absolutely, Brian. You raise legitimate concerns. You're not the only one with those concerns. I mean, I share them as well. When you give up privacy and you give up rights, it's very hard to get them back. And so we've seen a pattern, when we've been in wars, when we've faced emergencies as a nation or in our states, that's when many rights have been given up historically, and we don't, past history teaches us that oftentimes, at least, we don't get those rights back when the emergency passes. So we give our governments powers, and then, once the reason for giving those powers is no longer there, it doesn't automatically revert back. So it's a very legitimate concern, Brian, and I share it as well.
So from an employer standpoint, let's say that for whatever reason we opt not to get vaccinated and the employer is wanting that information. How would you recommend an employee go about having that conversation?
Well, respectfully, with open communication, with a minimum of confrontation, in writing at some point, if necessary, particularly if there's a sincerely held religious belief that's at issue or some kind of disability that makes the employee more susceptible to the adverse side effects. I would document that, raise that respectfully. But ultimately, the employee is going to have to make a decision, is this job worth it? and the decision may end up being no, it's not. And so you always have the power of walking, so to speak. Legal remedies are one thing, but they take time. They're generally expensive, and they're not always efficient. And the outcomes aren't guaranteed. One outcome that's guaranteed is if you make the decision as an employee, you know what, this just isn't working for me. The infringement on my rights is too great.
Quentin, you brought up a really good point from a legal perspective. Hopefully it would never rise to this level, but putting it in writing rather than having a conversation that would end up being hearsay if it ever got down to it. So, if we have concerns that our employer won't be understanding, probably the best way to approach this would be through an email, for example.
Yes, absolutely. Be careful what you put in the email because you're creating a record for posterity. So, again, respectful, offer to work out an accommodation and explore whether there's some less obtrusive way where your rights won't be violated. Maybe that might involve working from home if that is a potential. So try to work with your employer. And likewise, if you're the employer, the same advice, try and work with your employees. It's always best if you can do things by agreement, always.
Well, Quentin, thank you very much. Always appreciate the insight. Really good information.
Thank you, Brian. Stay safe in your neck of the woods there.